She called it drama, dismissed his pain like it was nothing. But then she saw the X-rays and realized the man she'd mocked had been carrying the weight of a war on his spine. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Helen stood in the doorway of her father's living room, her heart heavy as she watched George attempt to lift a dusty cardboard box from the bottom shelf of his bookcase. His movements were painfully slow, each motion accompanied by a subtle wince that he tried to hide. The box, filled with old family photos, wasn't particularly heavy, but George's face was etched with discomfort. "Dad, let me help you with that," Helen said, stepping forward. George straightened up slowly, his hand pressed against his lower back. "I've got it, sweetheart. Just these old bones taking their time." His attempt at a reassuring smile didn't reach his eyes. Helen noticed how his knuckles had whitened from gripping the edge of the box too tightly. The proud Vietnam veteran who had once carried her on his shoulders without breaking a stride now struggled with the simplest tasks. It broke her heart to see him like this. "How about I make us some coffee?" George offered, carefully setting the box on the coffee table. Helen watched as he made his way to the kitchen, his gait stiff and measured. Each step seemed to require conscious effort, though he tried to maintain his usual demeanor. "Dad, this isn't right," Helen said, following him into the kitchen. "You mentioned your back was bothering you weeks ago, and it's only getting worse." George busied himself with the coffee maker, his movements deliberate and careful. "It's nothing to fuss about, just part of getting older." He reached for the coffee filters in the upper cabinet, and Helen saw him bite back a grimace. "You keep saying that, but I've been watching you. This isn't normal aging, Dad, the way you're moving. It's like you're carrying a heavy weight all the time." The kitchen filled with the familiar aroma of brewing coffee, but the usual comfort of their morning routine was overshadowed by Helen's growing concern. She watched as her father leaned against the counter, trying to find a position that offered some relief. "Remember when I was little," Helen said, pulling out a kitchen chair, "and you'd tell me that being brave meant knowing when to ask for help?" She patted the chair seat. "Come sit down while the coffee brews." George's expression softened at the memory. He moved carefully to the chair, lowering himself with a barely suppressed groan. "You always were good at throwing my own words back at me. I learned from the best." Helen sat across from him, noting how he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Dad, you've been dealing with this pain for too long. I've seen how it's affecting you, the way you avoid certain movements, how you haven't been working in your garden lately." George stared down at his weathered hands, resting on the table. "Helen, honey, I've dealt with worse. In Vietnam, this isn't Vietnam, Dad, and you're not letting anyone down by admitting you're in pain." Helen reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "You taught me to face problems head-on, remember?" The coffee maker beeped, but neither of them moved. George's shoulders sagged slightly, a rare moment of vulnerability crossing his face. "It's been getting harder to ignore," he admitted quietly. "Then let's not ignore it anymore." Helen squeezed his hand. "I'm making an appointment with Dr. Brennan first thing tomorrow morning." George looked like he wanted to protest, but something in Helen's determined expression made him pause. Maybe it was the worry in her eyes, or perhaps he was finally ready to acknowledge that he couldn't soldier through this alone. "Your mother always said you had her stubborn streak," he said with a hint of a smile. "Wonder where I got that from." Helen stood and walked to the coffee maker. She poured 2 cups, adding a splash of cream to her father's just the way he liked it. When she returned to the table, George was looking at old black and white photographs that had spilled from the box. "Remember this day?" he asked, sliding a photo toward her. It showed a much younger George holding a small Helen on his shoulders at a county fair, both of them laughing at something off camera. Helen smiled at the memory. "You were so strong back then, Dad. Always making me feel safe." She set his coffee cup beside him. "Now it's my turn to help you feel safe." George's eyes grew misty as he looked at the photograph. "I just never wanted you to worry about me, sweetheart. That's not how family works, Dad. We worry about each other, we help each other." Helen touched his shoulder gently. "Tomorrow morning, we're going to see Dr. Brennan, and we're going to figure out what's causing this pain. No more brushing it off, okay?" After a long moment, George nodded. Okay, Helen, tomorrow morning. He lifted his coffee cup with both hands, and Helen pretended not to notice the slight tremor in his movements. They spent the rest of the afternoon looking through old photographs, their conversation drifting between memories and quiet moments of shared concern. Helen watched her father as he reminisced, seeing both the strong man from her childhood and the proud veteran who now needed help but struggled to ask for it. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the living room windows, Helen made her decision. She would not let her father continue suffering in silence. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. The antiseptic smell filled Helen's nostrils as she sat beside her father in Dr. Brennan's stark examination room. George perched uncomfortably on the paper-covered table, shifting constantly as pain shot through his back. Doctor. Brennan swept in, white coat pristine, reading glasses perched on her nose. Mr. Marks, what brings you in? I've been having back pain. George began steadily, despite his discomfort. Started a while ago, but it's getting worse. Some days I can barely rate this pain 1 to 10, Dr. Brennan interrupted, not looking up. Depends on the day. Sometimes 4 or 5, lately closer to 8. Dr. Brennan's pen paused. She looked over her glasses skeptically. 8? That's quite high. Sure you're not exaggerating? Helen's jaw tightened as her father's shoulders stiffened. No, ma'am, George replied quietly. I served in Vietnam and Afghanistan. I know pain. Ah, yes, a veteran. Dr. Brennan made another note. This pain just started recently? It's been building, Helen interjected. He can barely lift anything anymore. Dr. Brennan gave Helen a cool look. Any specific injury trigger this? She asked George. Not that I recall. Though in Afghanistan, there was an IED. Mr. Marks. Dr. Brennan cut him off, setting down her chart. Veterans often have complex relationships with pain. Past trauma can make us oversensitive. This sounds like typical age-related wear, possibly amplified by anxiety. Helen watched her father's face fall as he began doubting himself. Shouldn't you examine him? Run tests? Helen asked, keeping her voice level. Dr. Brennan sighed, pulling out her prescription pad. Not necessary. We'll start with pain management. Her pen scratched across paper. Mild painkiller, twice daily. Stay active. Sometimes focusing on pain makes it worse. George accepted the prescription with trembling fingers. If pain persists after 2 weeks, we'll revisit, Dr. Brennan said, moving toward the door. Heavy silence fell. George eased himself off the table, movements stiff and cautious. Dad, Helen started. It's fine, sweetheart, he said, attempting a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Maybe she's right. Maybe I'm just getting old. Helen sat at her kitchen table, the soft glow of her laptop screen illuminating her tired face. The clock on the wall ticked past. Midnight, but she couldn't stop reading. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten as she dove deeper into medical websites and veteran support forums. Page after page revealed stories that made her heart ache. Veterans describing pain that doctors dismissed, injuries that went undiagnosed for years, and the frustration of not being believed. One account particularly caught her attention. A soldier who had survived an IED explosion in Afghanistan. His symptoms matched her father's almost exactly. Joint pain, difficulty moving, chronic back issues. Helen mumbled to herself, jotting notes on a yellow legal pad. Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote, thinking about her father's own experiences in Afghanistan. The kitchen felt too quiet, too still. Only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional click of her mouse broke the silence. She pulled up another medical article, this one from a Veterans Health Journal. The words jumped out at her. Impact injuries from IED explosions can cause lasting damage that may not be immediately apparent. These injuries often worsen over time if left untreated. Helen pushed back from the table, rubbing her tired eyes. The kitchen clock now showed 1:30 a.m., but sleep felt impossible. Her father's pain-filled expression from earlier that day haunted her. The way Dr. Brennan had dismissed him, treated him like he was making it all up. It made her stomach churn with anger. She returned to her research with renewed determination. This time, she focused on finding doctors who specialized in treating veterans. She opened a new tab and typed Specialists, veteran care, spinal injuries. The search results filled her screen. She clicked through several profiles, reading reviews and credentials. Most seemed competent enough, but one name kept appearing in the comments. Dr. Daniels. Veterans and their families praised his understanding, his patience, his willingness to listen. Helen leaned closer to the screen, reading more about him. Dr. Thomas Daniels, specializing in spinal trauma and veteran care. 25 years of experience working with military personnel. She scrolled through the comments below his profile. Dr. Daniels took the time to really listen. First doctor who understood what I went through. He never dismissed my pain. Changed my pain. Life. Her eyes welled up with tears as she read testimonial after testimonial. This was what her father needed. Someone who would see him as more than just another elderly patient complaining about pain. The sky outside her kitchen window had begun to lighten when Helen finally picked up her phone. She knew it was too early to call, but she could leave a message. Her hands shook slightly as she dialed the number listed on Dr. Daniels' website. To her surprise, a warm voice answered after just 2 rings. "Good morning. This is Carol at Dr. Daniels' office." Helen glanced at the clock in surprise. "Oh, I didn't expect anyone to be there this early. We like to be available for our patients," Carol replied kindly. "How can I help you?" Helen took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "My father is a veteran, Vietnam and Afghanistan. He's been having severe back pain, possibly from an old injury, but his current doctor," she paused, swallowing hard. "His doctor isn't taking it seriously." "I understand," Carol said, her voice softening. "Dr. Daniels has openings next week. Would Tuesday at 10 a.m. work for you?" "Yes," Helen said quickly, relief flooding through her. "Yes, that would be perfect." As she hung up the phone, Helen felt something she hadn't experienced since before their visit to Dr. Brennan. Hope. She looked at her legal pad, covered in notes and research. Then at the brightening sky outside. Morning had come, bringing with it a new possibility for help. She picked up her phone again, this time dialing her father's number. It rang several times before his gruff voice answered. "Hello? Dad?" Helen said softly. "I know it's early, but I've found someone who might be able to help. A specialist who works with veterans. His name is Dr. Daniels." There was a long pause on the other end. Helen could hear her father's breathing, could almost picture him sitting in his favorite chair, probably already awake and fighting through his morning pain. "Helen," he started, his voice hesitant. "Please, Dad," she interrupted gently. "Just one more try. This doctor, he's different. He understands what veterans go through. I've read so many stories about him helping people like you." Another pause, shorter this time. "When's the appointment?" "Next Tuesday at 10, Helen said, relief evident in her voice. "I'll pick you up." "All right," George agreed, his voice tired but carrying a hint of something else. Maybe hope, maybe trust in his daughter's determination. Next Tuesday. Helen hung up the phone and looked at her notebook full of research. The morning sun now streamed through her kitchen window, casting a warm glow across the pages of notes. She had done everything she could to prepare for this next step. Now, they just had to wait for Tuesday. She walked to her coffee maker and started a fresh pot, knowing she wouldn't be sleeping anymore this morning. As the coffee brewed, she organized her notes, preparing all the questions she wanted to ask Dr. Daniels. This time would be different. This time, someone would listen to her father's story. This time, they would find answers. George shifted uncomfortably in the waiting room chair, his weathered hands gripping the armrests. The modern medical office was a far cry from the VA hospitals he was used to. Soft classical music played overhead, and the walls were decorated with calming landscape paintings. Helen sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. "It'll be fine, Dad," she said, giving his arm a please. Gentle squeeze. "Dr. Daniels comes highly recommended." George nodded but didn't speak. His jaw was set tight, the way it always was when he was nervous. The pain in his back had been particularly bad this morning, making the drive over feel like an endless journey. "George Marks?" A nurse called from the doorway, clipboard in hand. Helen helped her father stand, staying close, as they followed the nurse down a carpeted hallway. The examination room was warm and welcoming, with natural light streaming through a window. George eased himself onto the examination table, the paper crinkling beneath him. Dr. Daniels knocked briefly before entering, his presence immediately filling the room with a sense of calm competence. He was older than George had expected, with kind eyes and silver hair. "Mr. Marks," Dr. Daniels said, extending his hand. "I've reviewed your file, but I'd like to hear about your symptoms in your own words." George glanced at Helen before speaking. "Been having this pain for years now. Gets worse every winter. Can't sleep some nights because of it." Dr. Daniels nodded, making notes. "You served in Vietnam and Afghanistan, correct?" "Yes, sir. 2 tours in Nam, 1 in Afghanistan." "Were you ever near any explosions? IEDs, perhaps?" George's expression tightened. "A few. There was one. In Afghanistan. Threw our vehicle pretty good. But I walked away from it." "Doctor." Daniel set down his notepad and looked directly at George. "Just because you walked away doesn't mean you weren't injured. Sometimes the adrenaline masks the pain, and internal injuries can take years to manifest." For the first time since entering the office, George's shoulders relaxed slightly. Here was someone who understood, who wasn't dismissing his pain as mere complaints. "I'd like to order some x-rays, doctor." Daniels continued. "Today, if possible. Our imaging center is just down the hall." Helen leaned forward. "You think there might be something that other doctors missed? Given your father's history and symptoms, I want to get a complete picture of what we're dealing with." Dr. Daniels turned back to George. "The x-rays won't take long, but they'll give us valuable information." 20 minutes later, George found himself in the imaging center. The technician was efficient and friendly, positioning him carefully for each shot. The machine hummed and clicked, capturing images of his spine from different angles. "Just hold still for this last one, Mr. Marks," the technician said. "Almost done." George remained motionless, his thoughts drifting to that day in Afghanistan. The explosion had come out of nowhere. He remembered the heat, the noise, the way the world had turned upside down. He'd helped pull his men to safety, ignoring the burning in his back. There had been others more seriously injured. He couldn't waste time worrying about himself. The technician helped him up after the final image. "Doctor, Daniels will review these and discuss the results with you in a few days. You can wait in the main waiting room while I process these." Back in the waiting area, George lowered himself carefully into a chair. Helen had gone to move the car closer to the entrance, knowing the walk would be difficult after standing for the x-rays. He looked around at the other patients. A young mother with her child, an elderly couple holding hands, a businessman typing on his phone. None of them knew what it was like to carry the weight of war in their bones. The pain was there, as always, a constant reminder of things he'd rather forget. But for the first time in years, there was something else too, a glimmer of hope. "Doctor." Daniels had listened, had understood. Maybe, just maybe, there were answers to be found in those x-rays. The uncertainty of the next few days loomed before him. What would the images reveal? Would they finally explain the pain that had become his constant companion? Or would they lead to more questions, more tests, more disappointments? Helen returned, her keys jingling in her hand. "Ready to go home, Dad?" George nodded, using the armrests to push himself up. As they walked slowly to the car, he thought about all the times he'd pushed through the pain, all the times he'd told himself it was nothing. Now, waiting for answers, he felt both relieved and anxious about what those x-rays might show. 2 days would feel like an eternity. "Doctor." Daniels carefully placed the x-rays on the light box mounted to his office wall. The images glowed with an ethereal blue-white light, revealing the stark white bones of George's spine. Helen leaned forward in her chair, while George sat straight-backed despite his obvious discomfort. "Mr. Marks," Dr. Daniels began, his voice gentle but firm, "I want you to look at these images with me." He pointed to several areas along the spine with his pen. Do you see these irregular patterns here and here? George squinted at the images. Yes, sir. These show significant structural damage to your vertebrae. Dr. Daniels traced the affected areas. The kind of damage we typically see from powerful impact trauma. It's consistent with injuries sustained in explosive incidents. Helen's breath caught in her throat. She reached for her father's hand, but he kept his arms crossed tightly across his chest. Now, Mr. Marks. Doctor, Daniels continued, turning to face them both. You mentioned serving in Afghanistan. Were you ever near an IED explosion? George's face remained stoic, but Helen noticed his jaw tighten. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. There was one time. Our convoy hit something. I got thrown pretty good, but... He shook his head. We had men down. I couldn't just stop. Had to keep going. Dr. Daniels nodded sympathetically. That's exactly what I suspected. The impact from that blast caused severe trauma to your spine. The fact that you didn't receive immediate treatment allowed the injury to worsen over time. Helen felt tears welling up in her eyes. All these years her father had been carrying this invisible wound. But how could the military doctors have missed this? She asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. In the heat of combat, especially with more visible injuries taking priority, some trauma can go undetected, Dr. Daniels explained. Without immediate imaging, these kinds of injuries might not be apparent right away. And if Mr. Marks here didn't report his pain, he gave George a knowing look. George shifted uncomfortably. Had a job to do, he muttered. Couldn't let my men down. Dr. Daniels pulled up a chair, sitting at eye level with them. Mr. Marks, your dedication to your fellow soldiers is admirable. But this injury has been deteriorating for years. The pain you're experiencing now isn't just age or wear and tear. It's your body telling you that it needs help. He turned back to the x-rays, pointing out additional areas of concern. See these dark spaces between the vertebrae? They should be more uniform. The discs are severely compressed, and there's evidence of nerve impingement. This explains the shooting pains you've described. Helen watched as her father's stoic facade began to crack. His shoulders slumped slightly, and for the first time, she saw the weight of all those years of silent suffering in his eyes. So, what can we do? Helen asked, her voice stronger now, determined to help her father find relief. Dr. Daniels pulled out several detailed diagrams of the spine. The damage is extensive, and unfortunately, conservative treatments like physical therapy or pain management alone won't be enough to address the underlying issues. He spread the diagrams across his desk. In my professional opinion, the best course of action would be surgical intervention. George's head snapped up. Surgery? Yes, doctor. Daniels confirmed. We're looking at a complex procedure to stabilize the affected vertebrae and relieve the pressure on your nerves. It's not a simple operation, but it's your best chance at finding real relief from this pain. The room fell silent as the weight of this news settled over them. Helen studied her father's face, seeing the conflict there. The lifelong soldier who never wanted to appear weak, battling with the man who was tired of being in constant pain. What are the risks? George finally asked, his voice rough. Dr. Daniels leaned forward, his expression serious but compassionate. Any major surgery carries risks, and your age is a factor we need to consider. There's also the recovery period, which will require significant rehabilitation. But I want to be clear. Without intervention, your condition will continue to deteriorate. The pain will likely become more severe, and you could face more serious complications down the line. Helen squeezed her father's shoulder gently. Dad, this explains everything. All those years of pain. We finally know why. George nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the x-rays. All this time I thought I was just getting old. Thought maybe I was. He trailed off, but Helen knew what he'd been thinking, that maybe he was weak, that he should have been able to tough it out. Mr. Marks, Dr. Daniels said firmly, you've been walking around with an injury that would have laid most people flat. The fact that you've managed this long is a testament to your strength, not a sign of weakness. Tears welled up in Helen's eyes again, but this time they were tears of relief. Relief that finally Someone understood, someone could help. She watched as her father absorbed the doctor's words, saw something shift in his expression. "I'll need some time to think about this," George said quietly. Dr. Daniels nodded. "Of course. Take the time you need to discuss this with your family. But please, don't wait too long. The sooner we can address this, the better your chances for a full recovery." He handed Helen a thick folder of information. "This contains everything you need to know about the procedure, the risks, and the recovery process. Review it together. And call my office when you're ready to discuss the next steps." As they stood to leave, Dr. Daniels placed a gentle hand on George's shoulder. "Mr. Marks, you've carried this burden alone for a long time. Let us help you now." George nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Helen wrapped her arm around his waist, supporting him as they walked out of the office. The weight of the decision ahead hung heavy in the air between them, but for the first time in years, there was also hope that maybe, finally, her father could find relief from the pain that had shadowed him for so long. Helen sat in her living room, fingers wrapped tightly around a warm cup of coffee she hadn't touched. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. Around her, scattered on various chairs and the old floral couch, sat her younger brother Tom, her sister Marie, and their spouses. "So that's it," Helen said, setting down the untouched coffee. "The X-rays showed severe damage to Dad's spine. Dr. Daniels thinks it happened during that IED explosion in Afghanistan. The one Dad never talks about." Marie leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "But that was years ago. Why is it only showing up now?" "That's just it," Helen explained, pulling out the folder of medical information Dr. Daniels had given her. "It's been there all along, causing damage bit by bit. Dad just kept pushing through it, like he always does." Tom shook his head, his arms crossed over his chest. "Surgery, though? At his age? Helen, he's 72. That's a huge risk." "The doctor says," Helen started. But Tom's wife Susan cut her off. "Doctors always want to do surgery," Susan said, waving her hand dismissively. "It's how they make their money. Has anyone considered that maybe Dad just needs better pain management?" Helen felt her jaw tighten. That's what the process. First, doctor thought. She just wrote him off, gave him pills. But Dr. Daniels actually listened. He took the time to find out what was really wrong. "I'm not saying the pain isn't real," Marie said softly, reaching out to touch Helen's knee. "But Tom's right. Surgery at his age. The risks are serious. What if something goes wrong? What if we do nothing?" Helen countered, her voice rising slightly. She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "You haven't seen him every day like I have. You don't see how much pain he's in, how it's getting worse." The room fell silent for a moment. Outside, a car drove past, its tires crunching on the gravel driveway. "Maybe we should look into alternative treatments," Tom suggested. "Physical therapy, acupuncture, something less invasive." Helen pulled out the X-rays she'd brought home. "Look at these. Really look at them." She spread them out on the coffee table, pointing to the areas Dr. Daniels had marked. "This isn't something that's going to get better with physical therapy. The damage is extensive." Marie's husband, Pete, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward to examine the X-rays. "That does look pretty serious," he admitted. "But Helen, you have to understand our concerns. Major surgery at his age." "I understand everyone's worried," Helen said, gathering the X-rays back into their envelope. "But Dad's strong. He's healthy otherwise. Dr. Daniels says he's a good candidate for the surgery." "Has Dad even agreed to this?" Tom asked, his voice sharp. "Or are you making decisions for him again?" Helen felt the sting of his words. "I haven't made any decisions. I'm trying to involve all of you in this discussion because it's important. But don't pretend you know what's best for Dad when you only see him at holidays." Marie winced. "That's not fair, Helen. We all care about Dad." "I know you do," Helen said, softening her tone. "But I'm the one who's been there. I'm the one who's watched him struggle every day, trying to hide how much pain he's in. He needs this surgery. Susan stood up, crossing her arms. I think we need more time to think about this. Maybe get a second opinion? This is the second opinion, Helen reminded her. The first doctor wouldn't even look at him properly. Still, Tom insisted, surgery should be a last resort, not a first option. Helen looked around the room at her family's concerned faces. She saw worry there and love for their father, but none of them truly understood. None of them had seen George's face when Dr. Daniels finally validated his pain, finally gave him hope for relief. I appreciate everyone's input, Helen said, finally standing up, but I'm going to support Dad in whatever he decides, and if he wants the surgery, I'll be there for him. You're not listening to us, Marie protested. We're just trying to protect him. No, Helen said quietly but firmly. You're trying to protect yourselves from having to make a difficult decision. Dad's been protecting all of us his whole life, hiding his pain, staying strong. Maybe it's time we were strong for him. The room grew uncomfortably quiet. Tom and Susan exchanged glances before gathering their things. Marie lingered, clearly wanting to say more, but Pete gently guided her toward the door. Just think about what we've said, Marie called over her shoulder as they left. Helen stood in her living room, now empty except for the scattered coffee cups and the folder of medical information. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor, and she felt the weight of isolation settling over her. She knew she was right about the surgery, knew in her heart that it was the best chance for her father to find relief from his decades of pain. But standing alone in that quiet room, Helen felt the heavy burden of being the only one willing to take that risk. She gathered the unused coffee cups, carrying them to the kitchen sink, her movements mechanical as her mind churned with worry and determination. Through the kitchen window, she watched her siblings' cars pull away, leaving her alone with her conviction. She pulled out her phone and looked at Dr. Daniels' number, knowing she would call tomorrow to schedule a meeting about the surgery. The path ahead felt lonely, but she straightened her shoulders, reminding herself that sometimes doing the right thing meant standing alone. Helen sat across from Dr. Daniels in his warmly lit office, notepad balanced on her knee. Morning sun filtered through Venetian blinds, creating strips of light across medical diagrams. Despite dressing carefully to appear composed, her trembling hands betrayed her anxiety. Dr. Daniels spread X-rays across his desk. The surgery is complex, he explained, pointing at George's spine. We'll repair extensive damage here. The procedure takes several hours. Helen scribbled notes, handwriting unsteady. What are the risks? With major surgery at your father's age, there are significant risks. Infection, anesthesia complications. Recovery will be challenging. And without surgery, pain will worsen. Mobility will decrease significantly. Eventually, he might lose the ability to walk independently. Helen closed her eyes, remembering George struggling from bed that morning, face tight with pain despite his weak smile. I've performed this surgery many times, Doctor, Daniels continued reassuringly. While I can't guarantee perfect results, this is his best chance for better quality of life. For the next hour, Dr. Daniels detailed every step. Pre-surgery preparations, the procedure, post-operative care, rehabilitation. Helen wrote everything down, asking about physical therapy, pain management, complications. There's something else, Dr. Daniels said, closing the file. Physical recovery is only part of the journey. Many veterans struggle emotionally. The pain they've carried becomes part of their identity. Letting go can be challenging. Helen thought of her father's silence about his service. He's stubborn about accepting help, thinks it makes him weak. There's a veteran support group at the community center, Doctor. Daniels suggested, writing the information down. They focus on combat-related injuries. Might help both of you. Later, Helen stood outside the community center, clutching Dr. Daniels' note. Through glass doors, she saw people gathering in a meeting room. Taking a deep breath, she entered. The room was arranged in a circle, some chairs occupied by men and women of various ages. A man in his 50s wearing a Vietnam veteran cap smiled. First time? He asked, gesturing to an empty chair. Helen nodded, settling in. My father's having surgery for an old Afghanistan injury. You've come to the right place. A woman named Patricia said warmly, explaining her husband had undergone similar surgery 2 years ago. It's not easy, but you don't walk it alone. Helen listened to their stories, physical injuries untreated for years, invisible wounds carried silently. They shared experiences with surgery, recovery, and accepting help after years of self-reliance. The hardest part was admitting, I couldn't handle it alone. One veteran said emotionally, we're trained to push through pain. Asking for help felt like failure. How did you get past that? Helen asked. My daughter, she wouldn't give up on me. Sometimes we need someone to fight for us when we can't fight for ourselves. Patricia shared her husband's recovery experience. It's not just physical healing. Emotional walls start cracking during this process. Be prepared. Be patient. Helen found herself sharing more than intended frustration with Dr. Brennan's dismissal, surgery fears, struggle understanding her father's silence. The group listened without judgment, offering support based on their journeys. As the meeting ended, several exchanged numbers with Helen. Patricia hugged her, promising helpful resources. Come back, the Vietnam veteran said. There's strength in numbers. Stepping into late afternoon sun, Helen felt weight lift from her shoulders. She wasn't alone anymore. Helen found George sitting in his favorite armchair, staring at an old photograph. The evening light cast long shadows across the living room, making the moment feel heavy with unspoken words. She noticed how his weathered hands trembled slightly as they held the faded picture. Dad? She said softly, settling into the chair beside him. What's that you're looking at? George cleared his throat, his fingers tracing the edges of the photograph. My old unit, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Afghanistan, 2002. He passed the photo to Helen, and she saw a group of young soldiers, their arms around each other's shoulders, smiling, despite the dust and heat evident in the image. That's Martinez, George said, pointing to a young man with a broad grin, and Thompson next to him. His finger moved across the faces. Both gone now. The words hung in the air between them. Helen watched as her father's shoulders slumped slightly. She'd never seen him look so vulnerable. You never talk about them, she said gently. George's eyes remained fixed on the photograph. Some things are hard to put into words, Helen. He shifted in his chair, wincing at the movement. The pain, it's not just here. He gestured to his back. It's everywhere. In here too. He tapped his chest. That day, with the IED, his voice cracked slightly. Martinez was right behind me. Should have been me, not him. George's hands clenched into fists. I hear the explosions sometimes. In my dreams. Feel the heat. The pressure. Wake up thinking I'm still there. Helen reached out and touched his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. Dad, why didn't you tell me? What was I supposed to say? George's voice was barely above a whisper. That your old man can't sleep some nights? That sometimes I feel the pain so bad I can hardly breathe, but I'm afraid to tell. Anyone because they might think I'm weak? He shook his head. I'm your father, Helen. I'm supposed to be strong for you. But you don't have to carry this alone, Helen said, her own voice thick with emotion. George looked at her then, his eyes bright with unshed tears. You know what bothers me the most? The guilt. Surviving when others didn't. Coming home when they couldn't. He paused, taking a shaky breath. Every time the pain hits, I think maybe it's what I deserve for making it out. Helen felt her heart breaking. Dad, no. You don't deserve to suffer. I've tried so hard to keep it all locked away, George continued. The memories, the pain. Figured if I ignored it long enough, it would go away. But it doesn't, does it? He gave a bitter laugh. Just gets heavier. And now. He gestured to his back. Now my body's making sure I can't ignore it anymore. Why didn't you tell the doctors sooner? Helen asked softly. George's face tightened. Soldiers don't complain, Helen. We endure. That's what they taught us. He looked down at his hands. Down. He looked down at his hands. Besides, every time I tried to talk about it, people looked at me like I was making it up. Like I was just another veteran looking for attention. After a while, you just stop trying. Helen watched as her father's facade crumbled further. This man, who had always been her rock, her protector, was finally letting her see his wounds. Not just the physical ones, but the deep emotional scars he'd carried alone for so long. "I'm sorry," George said, wiping roughly at his eyes. "I never wanted to burden you with all this. You've got your own life to worry about." "Dad," Helen said firmly, taking his hand in hers, "you're not a burden. You're my father, and I love you. Your pain matters. Your story matters." She squeezed his hand. "Let me help you carry this." George looked at their joined hands, then back at the photograph. Thompson used to say we were all carrying invisible weights, said we needed to learn to share the load. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Guess I never was very good at that part." "It's not too late to start," Helen said softly. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of George's revelations settling around them like a heavy blanket. Helen realized that all these years, she'd been seeing only the surface of her father's pain. The physical injuries were just the tip of a much deeper iceberg of trauma and guilt he'd been carrying alone. "The surgery," George said finally, his voice steadier now. "I'm scared, Helen. Not just of the operation itself, but of what might come up when I can't keep busy fighting the pain anymore. When I have to actually deal with everything I've been running from." Helen felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Then we'll face it together, Dad. Every step of the way. You're not alone in this anymore," he whispered, the words carrying the weight of decades of unspoken pain. As the evening light faded around them, Helen sat with her father, both of them looking at the photograph of young soldiers who had carried burdens far heavier than any physical weight. She understood now that helping her father heal would require more than just fixing his spine. It would mean acknowledging and healing wounds that had been invisible for far too long. Helen's footsteps echoed through the stark hallway of the medical building as she approached Dr. Brennan's office. Her heart pounded, but her resolve remained firm. The same potted plants and generic artwork lined the walls, yet everything felt different this time. She wasn't here as a desperate daughter seeking help. She was here as an advocate. The receptionist recognized her immediately. "Mrs. Marks, do you have an appointment?" "No," Helen replied, straightening her shoulders. "But I need to speak with Dr. Brennan. It's about my father, George Marks." The receptionist glanced at her computer screen, then picked up the phone. After a brief conversation, she nodded. "Doctor, Brennan can see you in 15 minutes, if you'd like to wait." Helen sat in one of the stiff waiting room chairs, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The same medical magazines lay scattered on the table, but she couldn't focus on them. Instead, she rehearsed what she wanted to say, the words she'd been holding back since that first dismissive appointment. "Mrs. Marks?" Dr. Brennan's assistant called. "The doctor will see you now." Dr. Brennan stood behind her desk when Helen entered, her expression guarded but attentive. She looked different somehow, less imposing than Helen remembered. "Please, have a seat," Dr. Brennan said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "What can I do for you today?" Helen took a deep breath. "I needed to talk to you about my father, George Marks. You saw him a few weeks ago for his back pain." "Yes, I remember Mr. Marks," Dr. Brennan said, her professional mask firmly in place. "What you don't know is that we went to see another doctor," Helen continued, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Dr. Daniels ordered x-rays. They showed severe spinal damage from an IED explosion in Afghanistan, an injury that went undiagnosed for years." Dr. Brennan's composed expression faltered. She sat down slowly, her hands folding on the desk. I see. My father served this country for decades," Helen said, her voice catching slightly. "He's been living with this pain, hiding it, trying to be strong, and when he finally reached out for help, you dismissed him. You treated him like he was making it up." The doctor's face flushed. She looked down at her hands, then back up at Helen. "You're right," she said quietly. "I made assumptions about your father based on prejudices I didn't even realize I had." Helen hadn't expected this response. She'd prepared for defensiveness, for clinical detachment, but not for this open acknowledgement. I received a call from Dr. Daniels yesterday, Dr. Brennan continued. He shared your father's case with me. The X-rays. She shook her head. I should have ordered them myself. I should have listened. Yes, you should have. Helen agreed, but the anger she'd carried for weeks began to soften at the genuine regret in the doctor's voice. Doctor? Brennan stood up and walked to her filing cabinet, pulling out George's chart. I've been practicing medicine for 15 years, she said, returning to her desk. Sometimes we get comfortable in our assumptions. We think we've seen it all, know it all. But your father's case has made me realize how dangerous those assumptions can be. Helen watched as the doctor flipped through the chart, noting how her hands trembled slightly. Doctor, Daniels mentioned your father will need surgery? Yes, Helen nodded. It's scheduled for next week. I'd like to help, Dr. Brennan said, looking up. If you'll allow it, I'd like to be involved in your father's post-operative care. I have experience in pain management that could be beneficial during his recovery. Helen studied the doctor's face, searching for any sign of the dismissive attitude she'd shown before. Instead, she saw only sincerity and a desire to make amends. I know I can't undo my initial response, Doctor, Brennan continued, but I can do better now. Your father deserves that. All our veterans deserve that. Helen felt tears prick at her eyes. Why the change of heart? Doctor. Brennan was quiet for a moment, considering her words. After Dr. Daniels called, I spent hours reviewing your father's case. Then I started reading about veterans' experiences, about the invisible wounds they carry. I realized I've been part of a system that sometimes fails the very people who sacrificed everything to protect us. That's not the kind of doctor I want to be. She pulled a tissue from a box on her desk and offered it to Helen. I'm truly sorry, Mrs. Marks. I failed your father, and I failed you as his daughter. I'd like to make it right, if you'll give me that chance. Helen dabbed at her eyes, feeling the weight of weeks of anger and frustration beginning to lift. I'd need to discuss it with my father, she said carefully. Of course. Dr. Brennan nodded. And I'd like to apologize to him personally, if he's willing to see me. Standing up, Helen smoothed her skirt, feeling oddly lighter than when she'd walked in. I'll talk to him about it. Thank you, Dr. Brennan said, rising as well. Thank you for coming here today, for making me see what I couldn't or wouldn't see before. As Helen walked back through the hallway, her footsteps seemed less heavy. She'd come seeking justice, perhaps even confrontation, but she'd found something else instead, the possibility of change, of growth, even in people she'd written off as unchangeable. Outside, the afternoon sun warmed her face as she headed to her car. Tomorrow, she would tell George about Dr. Brennan's offer. For now, she simply sat in the driver's seat, letting the relief wash over her. Sometimes, she realized, the biggest victories came not from winning battles, but from finding unexpected allies in former adversaries. The morning sun filtered through the Venetian blinds in George's hospital room, casting striped shadows across the crisp white sheets. Helen sat in the padded chair beside his bed, watching as the nurse drew blood for the final round of pre-surgery tests. Despite his usual stoic demeanor, she noticed how her father's hands trembled slightly. Almost done, Mr. Marks, the nurse said cheerfully, pressing a cotton ball against his arm. You're being very brave. George managed a small smile. Had worse in the field, trust me. Once the nurse left, Helen reached for her father's hand. His skin felt papery and cool beneath her touch. How are you feeling, Dad? Like a pincushion, he replied. But his attempt at humor couldn't mask the worry in his eyes. They sure do love their tests here. Helen squeezed his hand. It's all to make sure you're ready for tomorrow, Doctor. Daniels wants everything to be perfect. George nodded, his gaze drifting to the window. Remember when you were little, and you broke your arm climbing that old oak tree in the backyard? How could I forget? You were so calm, even though I was crying my eyes out. Had to be calm, George said softly. Inside, I was terrified. Seeing you hurt, he shook his head. But I knew I had to be strong for you. Helen felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. Just like you've always been strong for me, Dad. Now it's my turn to be strong for you. A comfortable silence settled between them as they watched the morning light grow stronger. The hospital bustled around them. Footsteps in the corridor, distant voices, the gentle beeping of machines. But in their room, time seemed to slow down. Tell me about that summer vacation we took to the lake, Helen said, settling back in her chair. The one where I insisted on bringing that ridiculous inflatable dolphin. George's face lit up with the memory. That thing was bigger than you were, and it kept getting away in the wind. I must have chased it halfway across the beach at least 3 times. But you never complained, Helen smiled. You just kept running after it, even though you were exhausted from driving all day. That's what fathers do, George said simply. We chase inflatable dolphins and pretend we're not tired. George told her about the day she was born, how tiny she'd seemed in his arms, and how terrified he'd been of dropping her. Helen remembered the countless times he'd checked under her bed for monsters, always taking her fears seriously. When lunch arrived, Helen helped George sit up straighter in bed. The hospital food wasn't particularly appetizing. Sandwich, soup, and green jello, but George ate without complaint. You know what this reminds me of? Helen asked, watching him tackle the soup. That time you tried to make chicken noodle soup when I had the flu. You'd never cooked anything more complicated than toast before that. George chuckled. It was awful. The noodles were like rubber. But you tried, Helen said softly. That's what mattered. As afternoon faded into evening, Dr. Daniels stopped by for a final consultation. He reviewed the surgery procedure one more time, his manner both professional and kind. George listened attentively, asking a few questions about the recovery process. You're in good hands, Mr. Marks, Dr. Daniels assured him. Try to get some rest tonight. We'll see you bright and early tomorrow morning. After the doctor left, Helen noticed her father's expression grow more serious. What's on your mind, Dad? George was quiet for a long moment. I just want you to know, he began, then cleared his throat. Whatever happens tomorrow, I'm proud of you, Helen. You've been my rock through all of this. Dad, Helen's voice wavered. Let me finish, he said gently. I know I haven't always been the most open father. The war, it changed me, made it hard to talk about things. But you never gave up on me. You saw the pain I was trying to hide, and you fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. Helen wiped away tears. I learned from the best. You taught me what it means to never give up. As evening settled in, a nurse brought George's evening medication and helped him get comfortable for the night. Helen adjusted his pillows and pulled the blanket up around his shoulders, just as he had done for her countless times when she was small. You should get some rest, too, George said, concern evident in his voice. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Helen nodded, but didn't move from her chair. I will. Just let me stay a little longer. Darkness, the room softly lit by the monitoring equipment. Outside the window, stars began to appear in the purple twilight sky. The familiar sounds of the hospital seemed to fade away, leaving them in their own quiet bubble of time. Finally, when George's eyes began to droop, Helen knew it was time to say goodnight. She stood and leaned over the bed, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. I love you, Dad, she whispered. Love you too, sweetheart, he murmured back, his voice thick with emotion. Helen gathered her purse and jacket, pausing at the doorway to look back at her father. In the dim light, she could see the strong, brave man who had raised her, who had chased inflatable dolphins and made terrible soup, who had carried the weight of war silently for so many years. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, in this moment, they had each other, and that was enough. The pre-surgery wing hummed with quiet activity. In room 412, George lay on the narrow bed, his hospital gown making him look smaller. Helen stood beside him, her hand on his arm. Your blood pressure looks good, Mr. Marks, the pre-op nurse said, adjusting the cuff. Dr. Daniels will be here shortly. George nodded, jaw tight. Helen saw the muscle working in his cheek, his anxiety tell since childhood. His fingers played with the blanket's edge, folding and unfolding rhythmically. You doing okay, Dad? Helen asked, steadying her voice despite her nerves. Just ready to get it over with, George replied gruffly, though Helen detected the tremor beneath. Never liked hospitals. Think how much better you'll feel afterward. No more constant pain. George's eyes met hers, his mask slipping. What if it doesn't work, Helen? What if it will work? Helen said firmly, squeezing his arm. Dr. Daniels is the best. You're strong, Dad. Doctor. Daniels entered, surgical cap in place, reviewing George's chart. Good morning. How are we feeling? Like I'm about to have my spine reconstructed, George said dryly. Dr. Daniels chuckled. Exactly what we're doing. Let me go over the procedure once more. As the doctor explained each step, Helen watched her father's face. His expression remained neutral, but she noticed his intent listening, how his fingers stopped fidgeting. This was the soldier in him, facing challenges head-on. The anesthesiologist will be here in 15 minutes, Dr. Daniels concluded. Questions? George shook his head, then paused. Just, thank you for believing me when others didn't. Dr. Daniels' face softened. You served our country, Mr. Marks. We serve you in return. After the doctor left, heavy silence fell. George stared at the ceiling. Thoughts distant. Penny for your thoughts, Helen said softly. George's lips twitched. Thinking about Afghanistan, that IED, he breathed deeply. Never thought it would lead to this. Why didn't you tell anyone about the pain then? We were at war, Helen. Everyone was hurting. You patch up and keep going. That's what soldiers do. The anesthesiologist entered with equipment. Ready to get started? George gripped Helen's hand tightly. She felt his tremor, but his voice stayed steady. Ready as I'll ever be. The anesthesiologist explained each step, attaching monitors and preparing the IV. Helen watched the clear liquid flow into her father's veins. You'll feel drowsy soon, the anesthesiologist said. Just relax. George's grip loosened. His eyelids fluttered. Helen, he murmured. I'm right here, Dad. She leaned closer. Love you, sweetheart. His words slurred. Always been. So proud. Helen blinked back tears. I love you too. I'll be here when you wake up. Her father's eyes were closed, breathing deep and regular. You can walk with us to the OR doors, a nurse said kindly. Helen kept pace with the gurney through the halls, her hand on the rail, watching her father's peaceful face. They reached the double doors, marked Operating Room, Authorized Personnel Only. The team paused for Helen's goodbye. She kissed his forehead, skin cool beneath her lips. See you soon, Dad, she whispered. The doors swung open. Helen watched them wheel George away, the gurney disappearing into the bright corridor. The closing doors sounded unnaturally loud. A nurse touched her arm. The waiting room is down this hall. We'll update you throughout. Helen nodded, not trusting her voice. The nurse guided her to a large room with soft chairs and windows. Morning sunlight streamed in, creating warm pools on carpet. Other people sat scattered around, wearing identical expressions of worried anticipation. Finding a chair near the window, Helen sat heavily. She checked her phone. 8:47 a.m. The surgery would take at least 6 hours. The wait had begun. The fluorescent lights of the surgical waiting room cast harsh shadows across Helen's face as she paced back and forth. She'd already memorized every detail of the room. The faded blue chairs, the outdated magazines, the coffee machine that hummed in the corner. 6 hours had passed since they'd wheeled George into surgery. A door opened, and Dr. Daniels appeared, still in his surgical scrubs. Helen's heart skipped a beat as she studied his expression, trying to read the news before he spoke it. Mrs. Marks, he said, gesturing to the chairs. Please, let's sit down. Helen's legs felt weak as she lowered herself into the chair. How is he? Is he okay? Doctor. Daniels leaned forward, his hands clasped together. Your father is stable, he began, and Helen let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. But we encountered some complications during the surgery. The word complications seemed to echo in the empty waiting room. Helen gripped the armrests of her chair. What kind of complications? The damage to your father's spine was more extensive than we initially thought. There was significant scar tissue that had developed over the years, making the procedure more complex. Dr. Daniels paused, choosing his words carefully. We had to take extra time to ensure we didn't cause any additional damage. While we were able to complete the surgery, his recovery period will be longer than we originally anticipated. Helen's throat tightened. How much longer? Instead of the expected 2 to 3 weeks, we're looking at a minimum of 6 weeks before he can attempt physical therapy. And even then, progress will need to be very gradual. He placed a gentle hand on Helen's arm. I want to be clear. This doesn't mean the surgery wasn't successful. It just means we need to adjust our expectations for his recovery timeline. Helen nodded mechanically, trying to process the information. Can I see him? He's in post-op recovery now. Once he's moved to the ICU, you can sit with him. It will probably be another hour or so. Dr. Daniels stood up. A nurse will come get you when he's ready for visitors. After the doctor left, Helen sat alone in the waiting room, her mind racing. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders. She'd been the one who pushed for this surgery, who convinced George it was the right thing to do. Now, faced with complications and a longer recovery, doubt crept in like a shadow. When the nurse finally came to get her, Helen followed numbly through the sterile hallways to the ICU. The sight of George in the hospital bed made her breath catch. He looked pale and vulnerable, surrounded by beeping monitors and IV lines. His usually strong frame seemed diminished somehow, swallowed up by the medical equipment around him. She pulled a chair close to his bedside, careful not to disturb any of the tubes or wires. George's chest rose and fell steadily, his breathing aided by supplemental oxygen through a nasal cannula. The steady beeping of the heart monitor provided a rhythmic backdrop to her thoughts. "Oh, Dad," she whispered, gently taking his hand in hers. His skin felt cool to the touch, and she could see the bruising from the IV on the back of his hand. "I'm so sorry." Helen watched his face for any sign of consciousness, but he remained still, deep in a medicated sleep. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, creating patterns on the floor as time crawled by. Nurses came and went, checking vitals and adjusting medications, speaking in hushed tones. As evening approached, the doubt that had been nibbling at the edges of her mind grew stronger. Had she been too pushy about the surgery? Should she have listened to the family members who thought it was too risky? The what-ifs swirled in her head like autumn leaves in a storm. She remembered George's face when they'd first discussed the surgery, the mix of hope and fear in his eyes. He'd trusted her judgment, put his faith in her decision. Now, watching him lie so still and vulnerable, she wondered if she'd failed him. A nurse named Sarah came in to check George's vitals again. She must have noticed Helen's distress because she paused in her work. "The first night after surgery is always the hardest," she said kindly. "But your father's vitals are stable. That's what we want to see." Helen tried to smile, but couldn't quite manage it. I thought we'd be past the worst of it by now." When Dr. Daniels said there were complications. "Complications don't mean failure," Sarah said, adjusting George's blanket with practiced hands. "They just mean we need to be patient. Your father is strong. You can see it in his numbers." Helen nodded, but the knot in her stomach didn't loosen. She stayed by George's side as the hospital settled into its nighttime routine. The lights dimmed in the hallway, and the noise level dropped to a quiet hum. Still, she sat there, watching the rise and fall of his chest, listening to the steady beep of the monitors. Her own exhaustion began to catch up with her, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Dr. Daniels's face as he delivered the news about the complications. The gravity of the situation pressed down on her like a physical weight. The night nurse brought her a blanket and a cup of coffee, but Helen barely noticed. Her world had narrowed to this room, to the sound of George's breathing, to the silent prayer that she hadn't made a terrible mistake in pushing for this surgery. Through the window, she could see the stars appearing in the darkening sky. She remembered nights from her childhood when George would point out constellations to her, his voice steady and sure. Now she was the one who needed to be steady for him, but she felt anything but sure. She held his hand tighter, watching his face in the dim light. "Please be okay," she whispered. "Please, let this have been the right choice." But only the quiet beeping of the monitors answered her, and the night stretched ahead, long and uncertain. Helen watched her father's chest rise and fall as he slept in the hospital bed. The steady beeping of monitors had become her constant companion over the past few days. George's face was pale against the white hospital sheets, but at least the permanent grimace of pain had softened somewhat. "Miss Marks?" A nurse entered quietly, checking George's vitals. "He's due for his medication soon. Would you like to try waking him?" Helen nodded, gently touching her father's arm. "Dad, time for your medicine." George's eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding his features before recognition set in. "Helen?" His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "I'm here, Dad." She helped him take small sips of water. "How's the pain today?" He winced as he tried to shift position. "Been better." A ghost of his old stubbornness crossed his face. "Been worse, too." The nurse helped adjust his pillows while Helen assisted George in taking his medication. Even these small movements seemed to drain him, and Helen felt her heart constrict at seeing her strong father so vulnerable. Later that afternoon, during physical therapy, Helen watched as George struggled with exercises that would have once been effortless. The therapist, Sarah, was patient but firm as she guided him through gentle movements. "That's enough," George gasped, after just 10 minutes, sweat beading on his forehead. "You're doing great, Mr. Marks," Sarah encouraged. Just 2 more repetitions. Helen saw the familiar determination in her father's eyes as he pushed through, but she couldn't help wondering if they'd made the right choice. The surgery was supposed to help, but seeing him struggle with basic movements made doubt gnaw at her conscience. That evening, as Helen helped George with his dinner, her exhaustion caught up with her. She'd been sleeping in the hospital chair for days, going home only to shower and change clothes. The toll of worry and caregiving showed in the dark circles under her eyes. "You should go home," George said, noticing her stifle a yawn. "Get some real sleep." "I'm fine, Dad." Helen straightened his blanket, avoiding his concerned gaze. "Helen." His voice was stronger now, more like his old self. "You can't help me if you wear yourself out completely." She sat heavily in the chair beside his bed, finally letting some of her worry show. I keep thinking about whether we should have tried the surgery, seeing you in so much pain." "Stop that right now." George's voice was firm. "This was my choice too, and for the first time in years, I can feel my left leg properly. The pain's different now. It's healing pain, not the kind that was eating away at me before." Helen looked up, surprised. He hadn't mentioned that improvement before. The next morning brought small victories. George managed to sit up straighter in bed without assistance, and when the physical therapist arrived, he completed 15 minutes of exercises before needing to rest. "Your father's making good progress," Dr. Daniels said during his rounds. "The inflammation is decreasing exactly as we'd hoped. These first few days are always the hardest, but he's showing remarkable resilience." By the 5th day, George was able to take a few steps with a walker, though the effort left him exhausted. Helen noticed something different in his eyes, though, a spark of determination that had been missing before. "Remember when you were learning to ride a bike?" George asked during one of their quiet moments. "You fell so many times, but you never gave up." Helen smiled at the memory. "You wouldn't let me give up. You kept saying, 'One more try.' Well, now it's my turn for one more try." He adjusted himself in bed, grimacing, but managing it alone. "And I've got a pretty good coach." The next day brought a breakthrough. During physical therapy, George managed to walk the length of the corridor with the walker. Though he had to rest frequently, his steps were steadier than before. "Look at you go, Dad!" Helen couldn't keep the excitement from her voice. George's face was red with effort, but there was pride in his expression. "Feels good to be vertical again." That afternoon, Helen was reading him the sports section when she made a terrible pun about the baseball scores. To her surprise, George actually chuckled. A small sound, but genuine. "That was awful," he said, but there was a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. You loved it, Helen teased, feeling her own spirits lift at seeing his improved mood. The following day, George surprised everyone by asking to try standing for his morning wash instead of using the bed bath. Though it was challenging, he managed it with support, and the accomplishment seemed to energize him. "Baby steps," he said afterward, settling back into bed with less pain than before. But at least they're steps forward. Helen found herself starting to believe in the possibility of real recovery. The dark circles under her eyes remained, but her shoulders felt lighter. When George actually smiled at her terrible attempt at hospital cafeteria food humor, she knew they were turning a corner. A week after the surgery, George was sitting up in a chair by the window, watching the sunset. His movements were still careful and measured, but the initial crisis had passed. Physical therapy was showing promising results, and though recovery would be a long road, there was hope in his eyes that Helen hadn't seen in years. "You know," George said, looking out at the golden sky, "I think we made the right choice after all." Helen squeezed his hand, feeling the strength returning to his grip. For the first time since the surgery, she truly believed it too. That evening, as she helped him back to bed, George cracked a joke about the hospital gown fashion statement he was making. Helen laughed, and this time, his answering smile reached all the way to his eyes. It wasn't just physical healing she was witnessing. Something else was mending too, something that had been broken long before the surgery. The doctors were pleased with his progress, noting improved mobility and decreasing pain levels. Though George still had a long way to go, each day brought small victories. Sitting up straighter, walking a few steps further, staying awake longer. Helen watched as her father slowly but surely found his way back to himself, one careful step at a time. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the hospital room window as Dr. Brennan stood in the doorway, her usual confident demeanor replaced by something softer, more hesitant. She held George's medical chart close to her chest like a shield, her white coat crisp but her shoulders slightly slumped. "Mr. Marks," she said quietly, "may I come in?" George looked up from his crossword puzzle, his reading glasses perched on his nose. The hospital bed was raised, allowing him to sit comfortably. Though still pale, his face had regained some color, and the dark circles under his eyes had begun to fade. He gestured toward the chair beside his bed with a slight nod. Helen, who had been arranging flowers on the windowsill, turned to watch. She noticed how different Dr. Brennan looked now. Gone was the dismissive, hurried doctor who had barely glanced at her father months ago. Dr. Brennan settled into the chair, placing the chart on her lap. She took a deep breath. "I've been following your progress since the surgery," she began, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before. "The improvement is remarkable." George set his puzzle aside. "It's been a long road," he said simply. "Yes, it has." Dr. Brennan's fingers twisted together in her lap. "A road that should have been addressed much earlier. Mr. Marks, George, I owe you an apology." The room grew quiet, except for the gentle hum of medical equipment. Helen leaned against the wall watching this unexpected scene unfold. "When you first came to my office," Dr. Brennan continued, "I made assumptions. I let my own biases affect my judgment. I've treated many veterans over the years, and I'm ashamed to admit that I developed certain preconceptions." George's weathered hands rested on the blanket, his wedding ring catching the sunlight. He remained silent, but his eyes were fixed on Dr. Brennan, really seeing her for the first time. "I convinced myself that veterans often exaggerated their symptoms." Dr. Brennan's voice cracked slightly. "It was easier to dismiss than to dig deeper, to really listen. Your X-rays. They showed me how terribly wrong I was." Helen watched her father's face, seeing the decades of pain etched in the lines around his eyes. She remembered all the times he'd pushed through, all the moments he'd hidden his suffering to protect her. "The thing is, Doctor," Brennan continued, "I've spent the last few weeks really thinking about my approach to medicine. I've started attending seminars on veteran healthcare, learning about trauma-informed care." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small notebook. "I've been keeping track of every assumption I make, challenging myself to look deeper." George shifted in his bed, wincing slightly. "That's good to hear, Doc. It's not enough, I know. Dr. Brennan leaned forward. But I wanted you to know that your case, your story, it's changed how I practice medicine. I've started spending more time with each patient, really listening to their experiences. Helen moved closer to her father's bed, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. She could feel the tension in his muscles slowly releasing. Your daughter, Dr. Brennan gestured toward Helen. She never gave up. She knew something was wrong, and she fought for you. I should have been fighting alongside her, not standing in the way. George reached up and patted Helen's hand. She's always been a fighter, this one, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Got that from her mother. Dr. Brennan smiled softly. You've raised an incredible advocate, Mr. Marks, and I'm truly sorry for not being the doctor you deserved when you needed one. The silence that followed felt different now, not heavy with unspoken pain, but lighter, filled with possibility. George cleared his throat. Well, he said, we all make mistakes, Doc. The important thing is learning from them. Helen felt tears prick at her eyes, remembering all the doors that had been closed to them, all the times they'd been dismissed. But here was someone admitting their mistake, showing that change was possible. Thank you, Dr. Brennan said, standing up. I'll continue monitoring your recovery, if you'll allow me, and I promise, I'll do better, not just for you, but for all my patients. As she turned to leave, George spoke up. Doc, she paused at the door, maybe you could share what you've learned with other doctors. Might help someone else down the line. Dr. Brennan's eyes brightened. I've actually started putting together a presentation for our next staff meeting about recognizing and addressing our biases in veteran care. She smiled. Would you mind if I shared your story? George nodded. If it helps someone else get help sooner, share away. After Dr. Brennan left, Helen sat in the recently vacated chair. That was unexpected, she said softly. People can surprise you, George replied, reaching for his crossword puzzle again. Sometimes, they just need a wake-up call. Helen watched her father return to his puzzle, noting how his hands were steadier now, how he could sit up without grimacing. The road to recovery stretched ahead of them, but somehow it seemed less daunting now. Sometimes healing wasn't just about mending bones and muscles. It was about mending the breaks in trust, in understanding, in compassion. She glanced at the door where Dr. Brennan had stood, thinking about how one person's journey to understanding could ripple out, touching countless other lives. Maybe that was the silver lining in all of this, that their struggle might make the path a little easier for someone else. The afternoon sun continued its slow dance across the hospital room floor, and Helen felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. They had a long way to go, but they weren't alone on this journey anymore. The late morning sunlight filtered through the living room windows of George's house, warming the hardwood floors where a yoga mat lay spread out. Helen knelt beside her father, who sat on the edge of his recliner, his face etched with determination. Ready for today's exercises, Dad? Helen adjusted the cushion behind his back. George nodded, his jaw set. As ready as I'll ever be. His voice was gruff, but held a note of hope that hadn't been there before the surgery. Helen consulted the sheet of rehabilitation exercises the physical therapist had given them. Let's start with the gentle stretches first. She demonstrated the movement, raising her arms slowly above her head. George mimicked her motion, wincing slightly. Still feels tight. That's normal, Helen assured him, watching his form carefully. The doctor said it would take time. Remember how far you've come already? A ghost of a smile crossed George's weathered face. Yeah, at least I can get out of bed without feeling like I'm being stabbed in the back. They continued through the exercises, Helen guiding her father with gentle encouragement. When George's movements became too stiff, they took breaks, using these moments to talk, really talk, in a way they never had before. You know, George said during one such break, accepting a glass of water from Helen. I never thought I'd be doing yoga stretches in my living room, he chuckled, a sound that had become more frequent lately. Helen sat cross-legged on the floor beside him. Life's full of surprises, isn't it? Remember when you taught me to ride a bike? You were so patient, running alongside me for hours. George's eyes softened at the memory. Kept getting back up no matter how many times you fell. Wonder where I got that from, Helen said, squeezing his hand. As the days passed, their routine evolved. They started each morning with gentle stretches, building up to more challenging exercises. George's progress was slow but steady, marked by small victories that felt like mountains conquered. One particularly challenging afternoon, while practicing standing exercises, George's legs began to shake. Helen moved quickly to support him, but he waved her off. I need to do this, he insisted, gripping the back of a chair for support. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he focused on maintaining his balance. Helen watched, her heart aching with pride and concern. You don't have to push so hard, Dad. We have time. George's expression softened. I know, sweetheart, but for the first time in years, I can feel myself getting stronger instead of weaker. That means something. During their sessions, George began sharing stories from his past, not just the difficult memories of war, but happier ones too. He told Helen about the day she was born, how tiny she had seemed in his large hands, and how that moment had changed everything for him. I was terrified. He admitted one afternoon while doing his seated leg exercises. Your mother had just passed, and there I was, holding this perfect little baby. I had no idea how to be a father. Helen paused in demonstrating the next exercise. You figured it out pretty well, Dad. Their rehabilitation sessions became more than just physical therapy. They became a bridge between father and daughter, closing gaps that had existed for decades. 3 weeks into their home recovery routine, George's physical therapist delivered a sturdy wooden cane. It was polished maple, with a comfortable grip and good balance. Think you're ready to try it? Helen asked, holding the cane out to her father. George eyed it with a mix of apprehension and determination. Might as well give it a shot. Helen helped him position the cane correctly, standing close as he gripped it. George's knuckles whitened around the handle as he pushed himself up from his chair. Take it slow, Helen cautioned, hovering nearby but not touching him. She knew how important it was for him to do this himself. George stood, swaying slightly as he found his balance. The cane trembled against the floor, but held firm. He took a deep breath, then lifted his foot for the first step. The movement was small, barely more than a shuffle, but it was steady. Another step followed, then another. Each one was careful and deliberate, but they were steps, real steps, without the searing pain that had plagued him for so long. Helen watched, tears welling in her eyes, as her father made his way across the living room floor. His face showed concentration, but there was something else there too, a quiet joy, a freedom that had been absent for years. After reaching the window, George turned carefully, leaning on the cane. His eyes met Helen's, and in that moment, they shared a look of triumph that needed no words. How does it feel? Helen asked finally, her voice thick with emotion. George looked down at his feet, then back up at his daughter. Different, he said softly, like I'm finally moving forward instead of just holding on. The community center bustled with activity, as veterans of all ages gathered for the annual recognition ceremony. Helen watched her father adjust his tie for the third time, his weathered hands trembling slightly. George stood tall despite needing his cane, his military medals gleaming on his pressed navy blue jacket. You look perfect, Dad, Helen said, reaching out to straighten his collar. The familiar scent of his aftershave brought back memories of him getting ready for work when she was little. George cleared his throat. Been a while since I wore this getup. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the faces of fellow veterans, some young enough to be his children, others who had served alongside him decades ago. The hall was decorated with American flags and patriotic bunting. Round tables dotted the space, each with a small centerpiece of red, white, and blue flowers. The soft murmur of conversation filled the air, punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter. Helen guided her father to their assigned table near the front. Dr. Daniels said it would be good for you to get out more, she reminded him gently. And look, there's Frank from your support group. Frank, a fellow Vietnam veteran, waved from across the room. George lifted his hand in response, a small smile crossing his face. Over the past few months, the support group had become an unexpected source of comfort for him. The ceremony began with the presentation of colors. George struggled to his feet, standing at attention despite the twinge in his back. Helen noticed how he gripped his cane tighter, but maintained his straight pose until the flags were in place. The local VFW commander took the podium, his voice carrying across the hushed room. Today, we honor those who have served our country with distinction and courage. He began reading names, and with each one, a veteran stood to receive recognition. George Marks, the commander called out. Vietnam War and Afghanistan War veteran. Helen felt tears prick her eyes as she watched her father make his way to the podium. His steps were measured, careful, but dignified. The commander read from a prepared statement. George Marks served 2 tours in Vietnam and later answered the call to serve in Afghanistan. His dedication to duty and country exemplifies the highest traditions of military service. The commander handed George a special service medallion. As he accepted it, George's hands were steady, his expression solemn. But Helen could see the emotion in his eyes. Pride mingled with remembered pain, acknowledgement of sacrifices long hidden. When George returned to his seat, Helen squeezed his hand. He looked at her, and in that moment, she saw past the stoic exterior to the deep well of feeling beneath. The medallion caught the light as he turned it over in his hands. "Never thought I'd be standing up here," he mumbled, his voice rough with emotion. "All these years, just tried to forget. You deserve this recognition, Dad," Helen whispered. "Every bit of it." As the ceremony continued, Helen noticed how George seemed to sit straighter, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Other veterans stopped by their table, sharing quiet words and knowing looks. These were men and women who understood what George had been through, the physical pain, the emotional toll, the years of silence. When the formal proceedings ended, people mingled over coffee and cake. George spoke more than Helen had heard him speak in months, sharing brief stories with fellow veterans, nodding and understanding at their experiences. "Your dad's quite a man," one veteran's wife told Helen. "We've heard about his recovery journey. It's inspired many others to seek help." Helen watched as her father showed his surgery scar to a younger veteran who had been hesitant about his own medical treatment. George's voice was gentle but firm as he explained how facing his pain had finally allowed him to heal. As the afternoon light began to fade, Helen noticed her father's energy waning. "Ready to head home, Dad?" George nodded, gathering his cane and the medallion. They made their way slowly to the parking lot, the late autumn air crisp around them. Before getting into the car, George paused, turning to face his daughter. "Helen," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I need to say something." She waited patiently as he gathered his thoughts. "All these years, you've been there. When I was too stubborn to admit I needed help, when I tried to push everyone away," he gripped his cane tighter, "you never gave up on me. And today, standing up there," he gestured back toward the community center, "I realized I wouldn't be here without you." Helen felt tears welling up again as her father continued. "You fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself anymore. And I'm grateful, Helen, more than I can say." They stood there in the parking lot, father and daughter, sharing a moment of understanding that went beyond words. Helen gently wrapped her arms around her father, careful of his still healing back, and felt him return the embrace. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold as they drove home, the medallion resting safely in George's pocket, a tangible reminder that healing, both physical and emotional, was possible, even after all these years. The late afternoon sun streamed through the living room windows, casting long shadows across George's favorite armchair. He sat there, his cane propped against the side table, when the doorbell rang. Helen opened the door to find Dr. Brennan, standing on the porch, holding a small potted plant. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," Dr. Brennan said, her usual clinical demeanor softened by what appeared to be genuine concern. Her hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and she wore casual clothes instead of her typical white coat. Helen welcomed her inside, surprised by the doctor's unexpected visit. Not at all. Dad's just finished his afternoon exercises. George straightened in his chair as Dr. Brennan entered the room. The tension that had once existed between them had gradually dissolved over the past few weeks, but this was the first time she had visited their home. "Mr. Marks, Doctor," Brennan said, placing the plant on the coffee table. "I brought you a peace lily. They're known for bringing tranquility to a space." She paused, fidgeting with her hands. "And I wanted to check on your progress personally." Helen pulled up a chair for Dr. Brennan and settled onto the couch, watching as the doctor's eyes took in George's improved posture and the exercise equipment scattered around the room. "How are you really feeling, Doctor?" Brennan asked, her voice carrying a warmth that had been absent during their first meeting months ago. George shifted in his chair, considering the question. "Better than I have in years," he admitted. "Still some tough days, but I can get up in the morning without feeling like my whole body's fighting against me." Dr. Brennan nodded, pulling out a small notebook. "I've been doing a lot of research on veteran healthcare since your case. I've learned so much about the unique challenges veterans face, especially regarding chronic pain and old injuries." She looked down at her hands. "I realize now how much I missed during our first consultation." "We all make mistakes," George said quietly. "What matters is learning from them." Helen watched as Dr. Brennan's professional facade cracked slightly, revealing genuine emotion. "I've started working with a veteran support group at the Dodd Hospital," she continued. "Your case, it changed how I approach patient care completely. I'm listening more, really listening." George leaned forward, wincing slightly, but managing a smile. "That means a lot, Doc. More than you know. I'd like to be involved in your continued care," Dr. Brennan said, opening her notebook. "If you'll have me, that is. I've been consulting with Dr. Daniels, and we've developed some ideas for managing any residual pain you might experience." Helen felt her throat tighten with emotion as she watched her father and Dr. Brennan begin discussing treatment options. The doctor who had once dismissed George's pain was now fully engaged, taking detailed notes as George described his good days and bad days, his challenges and victories. "Have you considered hydrotherapy?" Dr. Brennan suggested, sketching out a potential schedule. "There's a new program at the hospital specifically designed for veterans with similar injuries." George's eyes lit up with interest. "That might help with the stiffness in my lower back." As they talked, Helen noticed how Dr. Brennan had transformed from a distant professional into someone who truly cared about her father's well-being. She asked about his military service, not just as medical history, but as part of understanding who he was as a person. "Your experience matters," Dr. Brennan said earnestly. "Not just your medical symptoms, but your whole story. I should have recognized that from the beginning." George reached for his water glass, his movements more fluid than they had been in years. "We all have our stories, Doc. Sometimes it just takes the right person to help us tell them." The conversation flowed naturally, touching on everything from pain management techniques to George's favorite fishing spots. Dr. Brennan took notes but also shared stories about other veterans she'd been working with, their successes and challenges. "I'm putting together a support group," she explained, "specifically for veterans dealing with chronic pain from old injuries. Would you be interested in participating? Your perspective could help others who might be struggling like you were." George glanced at Helen, who nodded encouragingly. "I'd like that," he said. "Might be good to talk with others who understand." Dr. Brennan smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes. "Excellent. And of course, I'd like to schedule regular checkups to monitor your progress. We can adjust your treatment plan as needed." As the afternoon light began to fade, Helen observed the easy rapport that had developed between her father and Dr. Brennan. The doctor who had once been a source of frustration and disappointment had become an ally in George's journey to recovery. "Before I go," Dr. Brennan said, reaching into her bag, "I have some literature about the hydrotherapy program and the support group. Take your time looking it over." She handed the materials to George, then turned to Helen. "And thank you, both of you, for giving me the chance to make things right." Helen smiled, watching as her father and Dr. Brennan continued discussing his future treatment options. The scene before her was a testament to how far they had all come. Her father sat straighter, spoke with more confidence, and seemed more at peace than she had seen him in years. Dr. Brennan had transformed from a dismissive physician into a compassionate advocate for veteran health care. The afternoon sun cast a warm glow across the room as they finalized plans for George's ongoing care. In that moment, Helen felt a profound sense of gratitude. The journey had been difficult, but it had led them all to a better place, one where healing went beyond just the physical. The evening sun painted the sky in soft shades of orange and pink as George and Helen sat on the wraparound porch of their family home. George settled into his favorite rocking chair, his cane propped against the armrest. The gentle creak of wood beneath them matched the rhythmic chirping of crickets in the distance. Helen watched her father's face, noticing how the lines of pain that had been etched there for so long had softened. He looked more at peace than she'd seen him in years. "Remember when I used to carry you on my shoulders right here on this porch?" George asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. "You'd stretch your arms out like you were flying." Helen laughed softly. "I felt like I could touch the clouds." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "Dad, I never knew how much pain you were in back then. You never let it show." George's rocking slowed. "That's what we did, honey. We soldiers. We carried on. Didn't want to burden anyone, especially not our children." "But it wasn't a burden," Helen said, reaching over to touch his hand. "All these years, I just wanted to help." "I know that now." George's voice was thick with emotion. "This whole experience, it's taught me that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let others help you." A cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the sweet scent of blooming jasmine from Helen's garden. George took a deep breath, seeming to gather his thoughts. "You know, I've been thinking," he said, his voice steady. "There are so many others out there, veterans like me, suffering in silence. They need to know they're not alone." Helen nodded encouragingly. "What are you thinking about doing?" "I want to speak at the Veterans Support Group, share my story." George's eyes were bright with purpose. "If I can help even one person seek help sooner than I did, it'll be worth it." "Dad, that's wonderful," Helen said, feeling a surge of pride. "You've come so far from the man who wouldn't even admit he was in pain." George chuckled softly. "Well, I had a pretty persistent daughter who wouldn't give up on me." His expression grew serious again. "You know, Helen, I never properly thanked you. Not just for the surgery and the recovery, but for believing in me when even I didn't believe in myself." Helen felt tears prick at her eyes. "You don't need to thank me, Dad. You've always been there for me." "Always." "Remember that day when Dr. Brennan first dismissed my pain?" George asked, shaking his head slightly. "I was ready to give up right then and there. But you wouldn't accept that." "I knew something was wrong," Helen replied. "I could see it in your eyes, even when you tried to hide it." George nodded, his own eyes growing misty. "That's the thing about pain. It changes you. But so does healing." He gestured to the garden before them. "Look at those flowers you planted during my recovery. They're blooming now, just like we are." Helen smiled at the metaphor. The garden had been her way of staying grounded during George's recovery, planting hope in the soil when she felt most afraid. "You know what I've learned through all this?" George continued, his voice gentle. "Sometimes the wounds we carry, the ones we can't see, they're the ones that need the most attention. And it's okay to say when something hurts. It's okay to reach out." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the sun dipped lower on the horizon. The first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "I'm proud of you, Dad," Helen said finally, "for everything you've overcome and for wanting to help others now." George squeezed her hand. "And I'm proud of you, sweetheart. You've got your mother's spirit, that same determination to do what's right, no matter how hard it gets." The mention of Helen's mother, gone now for 20 years, brought a warm smile to both their faces. They could feel her presence in moments like these, in the love that bound their family together. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Helen mused, looking out at the familiar neighborhood street where she'd grown up. "We sure have," George agreed. "And we're not done yet. There's still work to do, other veterans to help. Now I know I don't have to do it alone." The evening air had grown cooler, but neither of them moved to go inside just yet. There was something peaceful about sitting together, sharing this quiet moment after all they'd been through. The struggles, the fears, the triumphs. They had weathered it all together. George reached for his cane and slowly stood up, stronger now than he'd been in years. He looked down at Helen with a gentle smile. "Thank you for being my strength when I couldn't find my own." Helen stood too, wrapping her arms around her father in a tender embrace. They stayed that way for a moment, two hearts beating in sync, grateful for each other and for all that lay ahead. As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in deep purple hues, father and daughter stood together on their porch, their shadows merging into one. They had faced the darkest of times and emerged stronger, their bond deeper than ever before. In the peaceful quiet of the evening, they shared a moment of pure contentment, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of George Marks, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.